Hello everybody, and welcome to my channel. Today we will dive into a very interesting topic in US history, the American Civil War. So get some popcorn ready, and hopefully you'll enjoy the video. Prelude to War: the secession of the Southern states in 1860 to 61, and the ensuing outbreak of armed hostilities were the culmination of decades of growing sectional friction over slavery. Between 1815 and 1861, the economy of the northern states was rapidly modernizing and diversifying. Although agriculture, mostly smaller farms that relied on free labor, remained the dominant sector in the north, industrialization had taken root there. Moreover, northerners had invested heavily in an expansive and varied transportation system that included canals, roads, steamboats, and railroads, in financial industries such as banking and insurance, and in a large communications network that featured inexpensive, widely available newspapers, magazines, and books, along with the telegraph. By contrast, the Southern economy was based principally on large farms, plantations, that produced commercial crops such as cotton, and that relied on slaves as the main labor force. Rather than invest in factories or railroads as Northerners had done, Southerners invested their money in slaves, even more than in land. By 1860, 84% of the capital invested in manufacturing was invested in the free, non-slaveholding states. Yet to Southerners, as late as 1860, this appeared to be a sound business decision. The price of cotton, the South's defining crop, had skyrocketed in the 1850s, and the value of slaves, who were, after all, property, rose commensurately. The extension of slavery into new territories and states had been an issue as far back as the Northwest Ordinance of 1784. When the slave territory of Missouri sought statehood in 1818, Congress debated for 2 years before arriving upon the Missouri Compromise of 1820. This was the first of a series of political deals that resulted from arguments between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces over the expansion of the peculiar institution, as it was known, into the West. When Abraham Lincoln, the candidate of the explicitly anti-slavery Republican Party, won the 1860 presidential election, 7 Southern states – South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas – carried out their threat and seceded, organizing as the Confederate States of America. In the early morning hours of April 12, 1861, rebels opened fire on Fort Sumter at the entrance to the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. Curiously, this first encounter of what would be the bloodiest war in the history of the United States claimed no victims. With war upon the land, President Lincoln called for 75,000 militiamen to serve for 3 months. He proclaimed a naval blockade of the Confederate States. Although he insisted that they did not legally constitute a sovereign country, but were instead states in rebellion. The military background of the war. At first glance, it seemed that the 23 states that remained in the Union after secession were more than a match for the 11 Southern states. Approximately 21 million people lived in the North, compared with some 9 million in the South, of whom about 4 million were slaves. In addition, the North was the site of more than 100,000 manufacturing plants against 18,000 south of the Potomac River, and more than 70% of the railroads were in the Union. Furthermore, the Federals had at their command a 30-to-1 superiority in arms production, a 2-to-1 edge in available manpower, and a great preponderance of commercial and financial resources. The Union also had a functioning government and a small but efficient regular army and navy. The Confederacy was not predestined to defeat, however. the Southern armies had the advantage of fighting on interior lines, and their military tradition had bulked large in the history of the United States before 1860. Moreover, the long Confederate coastline of 3,500 miles, 5,600 kilometers, seemed to defy blockade, and the Confederate President Jefferson Davis hoped to receive decisive foreign aid and intervention. Confederate soldiers were fighting to achieve a separate and independent country based on what they called Southern institutions, the chief of which was the institution of slavery. So the Southern cause was not a lost one. Indeed, other countries, most notably the United States itself, in the American Revolution against Britain, had won independence against equally heavy odds. The high command problems plagued both sides. Of the two rival commanders-in-chief, most people in 1861 thought Davis to be better than Lincoln. Davis was a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy, a hero of the Mexican-American War, and a U.S. representative and senator from Mississippi. Lincoln, who had served in the Illinois state legislature and as an undistinguished one-term member of the U.S. House of Representatives, could boast of only a brief period of military service in the Black Hawk War, in which he saw no action. As President and Commander-in-Chief of the Confederate forces, Davis revealed many fine qualities, including dignity, firmness, determination, and honesty, but he was flawed by his excessive pride, hypersensitivity to criticism, poor political skills, and tendency to micromanage. To a large extent, and by his own preference, Davis was his own Secretary of War, although 5 different men served in that post during the lifetime of the Confederacy. Davis himself also filled the position of General-in-Chief of the Confederate armies until he named Robert E. Lee to that position on February 6, 1865, when the Confederacy was near collapse. To the astonishment of many, Lincoln grew in stature with time and experience, and by 1864, he had become a consummate politician and war director. Lincoln matured into a remarkably effective president because of his great intelligence, communication skills, humility, sense of purpose, sense of humor, fundamentally moderate nature, and ability to remain focused on the big picture. Lincoln appointed Ulysses S. Grant on March 9, 1864, as Chief Command. Grant served efficaciously as General-in-Chief throughout the remainder of the war. Strategic plans. In the area of grand strategy, Davis persistently adhered to the defensive, permitting only occasional spoiling forays into Northern territory. Perhaps the Confederates' best chance of winning would have been an early grand offensive into the Union states before the Lincoln administration could find its ablest generals and bring the preponderant resources of the North to bear against the South. On the other side, to crush the rebellion and re-establish the authority of the federal government, Lincoln had to direct his blue-clad armies to invade, capture, and hold most of the vital areas of the Confederacy. His grand strategy was based on Scott's so-called Anaconda Plan, a design that evolved from strategic ideas discussed in messages between Scott and McClellan on April 27, May 3, and May 21, 1861. It called for a Union blockade of the Confederacy's coastline as well as a decisive thrust down the Mississippi River and an ensuing strangulation of the South by federal land and naval forces. But it was to take 4 years of grim, unrelenting warfare and enormous casualties and devastation before the Confederates could be defeated and the Union preserved. The War. In 1861, the first military operations took place in northwestern Virginia, where non-slave-holding pro-Union Virginians sought to secede from the Confederacy. McClellan, in command of federal forces in southern Ohio, advanced on his own initiative in the early summer of 1861 into Western Virginia with about 20,000 men. Although showing signs of occasional hesitation, McClellan quickly won 3 small but significant battles: on June 3rd at Philippi, on July 11th at Rich Mountain, and on July 13th at Carrick's or Corrick's Ford, all now in West Virginia. Meanwhile, sizable armies were gathering around the federal capital of Washington, D.C., and the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. With Lincoln's approval, Scott appointed Irvin McDowell to command the main federal army that was being hastily collected near Washington. McDowell advanced from Washington on July 16th with some 28,000 men and moved slowly toward Bull Run. When McDowell attacked on July 21st in the First Battle of Bull Run, he discovered that Johnston had escaped the Federals in the valley and had joined Beauregard near Manassas just in time, bringing the total Confederate force to about 32,000. McDowell's sharp attacks with Green troops forced the equally untrained Southerners back a bit, but a strong defensive stand by Thomas Jonathan Jackson enabled the Confederates to check and finally throw back the Federals in the afternoon. The Federal retreat to Washington soon became a rout. McDowell lost 2,896 men. First Battle of Bull Run left a lasting impression on both the Confederacy and the Union. And there you have it, the first part of the American Civil War. Next time, we will dive into the second part of the war, the year of 1862, and the Emancipation Proclamation by Abraham Lincoln. Feel free to leave a like, share, and subscribe for future videos like this. Thank you.